the Committee of the Whole from the Tuesday, February 27th regular council meeting, and I guess I'm handing this to the CAO. You're off.
Hang on.
There we go.
Okay, my thing doesn't like me today. Sorry, can't. I'm just trying to log in. Oh, and there's Councillor Hogan. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council, for dedicating some time to talk about housing and homelessness in our community. I provided you at the last meeting 2 briefing notes. The one that we're going to speak about today is what I'm calling the Housing Merit Project. And it's coming about in conjunction with all the legislative changes that we're seeing around zoning and the downloading of housing responsibilities that the province seems to be putting towards the municipalities, and how we can support that. Housing and homelessness, again, it's not an issue that is unique to Merit, nor is the concept of affordable or housing, the lack of affordable housing, a concept that's unique to Merit. I think we talked about last time sort of the average cost of housing versus the mean income of residents in the area, and that ultimately most of our residents would not be approved for a mortgage on the cost of most of the houses in Merit. And so we're in a unique position because we have some resources at our disposal that could be used to develop a program of some sort. And in the briefing note, I kind of talked about the idea perhaps of a housing authority or housing corporation as one potential method of addressing housing needs in the community. There are other options. Councillor Egan had sent around some information about a land trust, which is another option. Another option is development corporations providing funding or investment in development that would be the city would get a return on. So there are a lot of options around how the city could support housing development, and particularly below market or low market housing.
So, Mike, this would put us in a fairly unique position as a community. There's not a lot of communities that are able to do this with housing and have their own housing fund. Is this correct?
So there are communities that are doing it. However, they don't necessarily have the built-in resources that we do in regards to still having some funding from the flood housing envelope that was identified by the provincial government to support housing in the community. And then also because we have the mobile homes that were purchased as part of the flood recovery, which we will have to dispose of in some fashion. So sell is identified as the means to get out of that we will have some revenue from that as well. So what we end up with is somewhere between probably $4 and $9 million worth of investable funds to support some sort of housing support for the city. And that would be an ability for us to take those funds and invest and get a return on those investments in some fashion so that we can support the development of housing, again, below market and low market, so affordable housing for people in the community. So that's the more unique part, is that we have this built-in resource that we have to do something with.
Okay, so let's visit the 31 trailers at the trailer park. The reason we have to, there was a whole situation how this program goes, right? Mm-hmm. So could you explain that for those who may not be aware of how this goes and how it ends?
Yes. So what happened was the housing recovery or the flood recovery team received an indication that they would get just over $11 million in support for some sort of transitional housing program for people who were unable to return to their residence post-flood. The idea was that, and it's kind of broken into two sections. There are houses that the people who went, I mean, again, it was a year and a half, almost 2 years later, but the people who were still unhoused, who had been directly impacted by the flood, were given the first go around on those trailers. So anybody who still needed housing was given that opportunity at a low cost, a below market cost, I think, for most of them. The second round was we hadn't filled all the trailers. So the second round is people who are indirectly impacted by the flood. So we obviously lost some rental market based on houses not being returned to their pre-flood condition, or them not putting illegal or legal suites back into those houses for rental. So there are a group of people that live in those those mobile homes who are paying more of a market rate. However, what we know is that we have to get out of that program. It's meant to be a temporary, in the name, temporary emergency mobile housing. So we have to get out of that. That has been extended to the end of 2025. It was originally supposed to end this year, 2024. And so it's been extended to the end of 2025. But by that time, we have to have a plan to dispose of those assets. The $4 million that's left was because we didn't need any additional units.
Okay. So this was the provincial guideline on this. Yeah, okay. That's it. Thank you.
So ultimately, at this point, we are in a unique position where we can do a fair amount of work on this. However, it does take additional resources and to develop a plan that's appropriate for the city of Merritt and not just a cookie cutter plan.
Councillor Charney.
Okay, I'm going to read this. I don't usually do that, but this time I am. It's hard to believe that the $4 million was never used for housing for flood victims since 2021. People in the flood area went through financial hardship and suffering, and the city sat on $4 million. It is also hard to believe that this money could potentially be returned to the government without it ever being used for what it's designated for. This money was given to Merritt under the umbrella of the 2021 Flood Recovery Fund. This was designated for flood victim and Merritt's recovery and was not intended for local affordable and below market housing or for homelessness. As a community, we should be looking at how this money can be utilized to help flood victims that were directly impacted by the flood. Using the money for affordable and below market housing would be profiting off someone's misfortune and misery. Council should be made aware of how this money was intended and why this plan was never fulfilled. Did the city do all they could for flood victims if there is still $4 million left in the recovery fund? Unfortunately, if the city cannot develop a viable and realistic plan for using this money for post-flood housing in Merritt, then it should be returned. On a needs assessment basis, does Merritt really need to develop a housing corporation with a budget of $975,000 for year one and $806,120 for year two? The Housing Supply Act is targeting communities that have the greatest housing need. Do we fit in this category? From my limited knowledge, I do not think so. Merritt already has 4 social housing complexes. Three Eagles has 32 units, Juniper House has 30, Cedar Terrace has 30, Connate Friendship has 40. The CNA is in the process of building a 58-unit multi-generational complex. The City of Merritt has 31 units that are currently being used, and I understand they have to be sold. We also have 2 senior houses, Ainsley House and Tradewinds. Those are all below market housing units. Listed on MLS are 70 houses for sale, not including any bare lots. Of the 70 units, 7 are listed as modular units and 4 are apartments. Price ranges 46 or 500,000 and above, 15 or between 400 and 500,000, 9 or 400,000 and below. There are many rental units that are vacant and new rental units being built. Prices for rental have been high in the past due to the pipeline workers and the flood housing situation. Both situations have eased off and the rental prices are beginning to drop. The median house price for sale has dropped $30,021 since September of 2023. Simple supply and demand. As required by the provincial government, a housing needs report using standardized methodology must be completed. No decisions by this council should be made until this has been completed. With Bills 44, 46, and 47, individuals will be able to build up to 4 units on a lot size between 1,215 meters square and 4,050 meters squared. The cost of building a twoplex, 2 up and 2 down, is approximately 20% cheaper than building a single family dwelling. This cost saving could potentially affect the rental price per unit or the sale of each unit, making the cost to build multi-units attractive. The city should be encouraging this type of development versus getting directly involved in the development of a housing project. Carriage houses and rental suites should also be encouraged. Put housing in the hands of the community and not the local or provincial governments. This becomes much more sustainable and no risk to the municipality. The proposal states that the city is looking for a means to invest in local, affordable, and below market housing. But in the proposed budget, $100,000 has been earmarked for a housing and homelessness strategy. This becomes confusing. We have provincial agencies responsible for homelessness. Year 1 of the proposed budget has a $284,000, and in year 2, $296,317 aimed for 2 wages, a director and a clerk. These jobs will entail exploring and ensuring best practices. A lot of money for just studying housing. In my opinion, not the best use of taxpayers' dollars. I was going to go through the 31 units, their income versus expenses, which there is no insurance listed as an expense, which I am assuming the city has to pay insurance on those units, but it's not listed. So just using these units alone puts the city on solid grounds with relation to the Housing Supply Act. What Merritt needs more than more affordable housing is industry. If the city does not attract more industry into the area, there will be no need for further housing in Merritt. People will be leaving. In my opinion, this housing project has nothing to do with any government requirements and all to do about using funds that were allocated for post-flood housing. I strongly object to using money that was intended for flood recovery on affordable housing. And that is my position on that.
Cool.
I will just say the allocation of those funds were for the by the provincial government were for the temporary housing program, not to pay directly to flood victims for repair of their housing. That was the approved use of that funds. So the $4 million was in that envelope and did not need to be used because we had enough units to meet the need. It was not allocated at any point in time by the provincial government to go directly to people who were had houses damaged by the flood.
Councillor Egan.
Okay, well, that was my question, is like, what were the exact rules on the use of that money? Because it does seem kind of strange to me for the city to have had $4 million sitting there gaining interest and doing nothing with it when we had people going broke and people, you know, exhausting all their various means to just get by. And I don't know whether some of the most devastated actually took some of those trailers or not, or whether they moved. But the point is that the rules need to have been brought to our attention so we would be able to make a more informed decision, I guess, yes, at this time. I kind of confer with Councillor Charney and what she's saying, and you've definitely done your homework. I would hate to see the money to go back to the provincial government or the federal government, wherever we got the money from, but I think a needs assessment has to be done first before anything gets approved.
Councillor Richard.
Well, first off, we have had a housing needs assessment which shows that we desperately need more housing for vulnerable population and for those over 65 because of the increased numbers. And that was especially studied when we made the OCP change in 2020. We do have a lot of changes that were done in the last OCP amendment allowing for duplexes available and suites to be put in. So Merit has been working on that for the last number of years. So that's not a concern. And I agree that multi-level housing is a cheaper way to go. But also, when the recovery team was started, it wasn't as if we had this funding that came to us immediately. It wasn't given, you know, on day 2 of the flood, and we had all this money. Some people that completely lost their residences were trying to find temporary houses wherever they could. Thank goodness that we had supports from Red Cross and also Samaritan's Purse. I see Sherry's here, and thank you, by the way, for every wonderful thing that you guys have done to support the community. So many different organizations. There was meetings morning, noon, and night happening with all hands on deck going, with all the groups looking for everything that we could, all the staff that were pulled in here trying to get funding for everybody. It's not as if any city employee was sitting here on any kind of funds and not wanting to help people. There's also rules with a lot of this money. You can't just go and fix personal property of other people. People were expected to go to their insurance companies and either be declined if they didn't have any overland flood coverage, and then apply to DFA. The city thought we were going to have to spend approximately 20% of any city-owned properties of damages that was going to have to come out of reserves, which we didn't have any money for, and that money was awarded quite some time after the flood. So making a decision to try and find spots that we could have units. Diamond Vale Park was expressed as an area where there was some availability for some emergency housing, and then it takes time to order these homes. So I think that the recovery team did a very good job with what we had available. Also, coming out of COVID, you only have so many mobile home options. I think a lot of them had to be trucked out of Alberta. I don't know exactly where they came from. It wasn't like we knew exactly where they were being delivered from. So there was site prep, there was different things. So as we were working as fast as we could with getting some of the homes, I think the earliest move-in date was February 28th last year for some people. It had already been a year, so some people had to find some other housing and supports. So some people were fortunate enough to have insurance. Some people were fortunate enough to have some assistance from Red Cross and other organizations. Some people were not as lucky. Some people got some money from the Disaster Financial Assistance Program and some hard work. And again, I can't thank these organizations enough that have been helping the community. Sherry, again, thank you so much. You have been supporting people spiritually and manually with the groups, everything. I mean, it's amazing. I know that we had a lot of volunteer days with the previous council where we were trying to get, you know, scooping mud out of people's houses. It was just a, you know, when you're in it, we had morning meetings, evening meetings, saying to come up with a statement that we have sitting on $4 million just simply isn't the case. The staff couldn't have worked any harder. Some of them here, you know, 16 hours a day during the flood, you know, using the outhouse when we had no water, people being away from their families. We tried to get and spend as much as we could for the flood victims that had no homes and getting them as fast as we could. And the fact that we spent only 7 million of the 11 million was because there's only so many spots that you could have. There was 31 pad rentals available that were identified. It's not as if there was a great abundance of properties available to put homes all over town. The one park was completely shut down. Trees Mobile Home Park was damaged. The other park, El Dorado, I think is quite full. So Diamond Vale was the logical spot and also not beside the river. So before anybody gets concerned about what council did or didn't do, I think that we made the best decision with what was available, and also the availability to get quality housing that was able to be delivered. It was a challenge, and also from the flood, unfortunately, a lot of these people have ended up homeless because their rental's been destroyed, and they're trying to find accommodations where they can. Maybe that's in Counts, maybe that's in Kelowna, and a lot of these residents would like to return back to Merritt. Also, with the increase in population with immigration that's expected to come to the province over the next 10 years, there's probably going to be a lot more people that are here. And even though that we have some housing supply that's here and some rents are coming down, isn't it interesting that Cedar Village, which I think has 44 units, not 30, because you had mentioned Cedar Village only had 30 units, Councillor Charney, but I think it actually has 44. It was full quite quickly when it opened last March. So I think that if the housing's available, it will be full. I know that Juniper House seems to be full. I know that the Cedar Terrace seems to be full, and the Tradewind seems to be full. So while you think that maybe nobody will fill those units, I disagree. I don't think that there's a problem filling any units in Merritt. So, and I also think that once we start developing property in Merritt, a lot of the trades will be here working because there'll be projects to work on as well. So anyway, I'll stop talking now. Thank you very much.
Councillor Hogan.
Thank you.
No, I don't believe we are. I think that was probably the Housing Accelerator Fund, the CMHC Housing Accelerator Fund, which we applied to, would have started the application on in last spring and applied to in the fall, which we received update on Friday that we won't be receiving any funding through the Housing Accelerator Fund. Sorry, Councillor Ogan. Yeah, thank you for that clarification. That is actually, but what we've determined through our internal review process is that it's probably just over 4 million left in the envelope. So the 3.2 is actually a little bit more. But yes, that is that funding. So my apologies.
Okay.
Councillor Petrosi.
Just reading your report here, under next steps, and number 5 is ensure necessary data is available, including the completion of an updated housing needs assessment, which is a requirement of the new housing legislation. And that's number 5, and I guess maybe that should be like number 1, a needs assessment. Like it hasn't been done yet, has it?
No, so we're in the process. An RFP is going out. We're working with TNRD and the other municipalities and electoral districts to do a larger RFP. Ultimately, we have data from 2021, which is recent enough, but doesn't take into account the impacts of the flood. So we have recommendations on where we need to focus, which are further up in the briefing note, in regards to from that housing needs assessment. And when you're talking like numbers and percentages, that's a fluctuating thing, right? Like that's dependent year to year. So we're not going to be exact, but the key recommendations are promote and protect housing affordability in the market, expand non-market and supportive housing options, address growth in population age 65 years and over, and obviously the housing needs for them, whether that be supported long-term care or independent living in smaller residences or smaller units. Manage growth. Again, what is the difference between the need for market housing versus non-market housing or below market housing? So typically a developer is not going to engage in developing below market housing without some sort of support. So what happens, and in most places where they're doing this work, and the housing experts are talking about, is that we can build 1,000 houses. It doesn't make them affordable. We have to focus on how to make affordable units or below market units available. And the idea around that is, if you have a developer, so like the 3.2 and the project in that over by Save-On, the idea would be that we would collaborate with a developer, invest some funds from the city, and we would get a return on those funds. The idea would be that a certain number of those units would be below market, so that we would address that need, but the developer would still be able to have at market housing in order to make the profit that they need to make to invest in developing something. And that's a little easier too if you have commercial space on the main floor, for instance, because obviously they can charge a little bit more for commercial space. But housing developers, private housing developers, are not going to build below market housing. So you're saying that's number one. However, what's going to happen is the provincial government is going to ask us for the money back. They've made some inquiries about it and whether or not we have a plan to use it. So that is why we need to develop a system or a project to make this happen. We do not have the internal resources to do this project. Once the, one of the things is taking this out of recovery is because once they start building bridges and dikes, they're going to be tapped out and they're not going to be able to do this work. So we need to pull this work out, and we need to resource this work properly in order to maximize the use of this money, including what happens with those trailers, with mobile homes. We have to be able to start working on that because we need to develop a plan for disposition of those.
Do we have some real numbers of how many homes are still sitting empty from the flood? Just walking down Coldwater from Maine to vote, there's numerous houses. You can count how many that are still empty. How many are still empty? How many, wouldn't it be nice to actually know how many are still empty from? And I think there's quite a few. And it's like helping the people from the flood, and it's a shame that 4 million, I know it was earmarked for something else, but I'm just thinking all these homes that are so empty and these people that have possibly left, I don't know, but it'd be nice to actually get some true numbers on what's going on after the flood.
Yeah, I can ask to get that for you and can get that in the email to you fairly shortly. I think, and when you're thinking about those houses too, is if those people have, my family grew up in a place called Elliott Lake, and when the uranium mine closed, people dropped their keys in their mailbox and walked away because they couldn't sell their houses and they couldn't deal with their mortgages. So they basically just walked away from houses, brand new houses, right? And so there may be people who have ultimately walked away, and we have to figure out how do we reclaim those spaces, right? Because some of them could be ones that we could put somebody could put additional development on, but we need to have a sense of that. And so that's correct.
We need to know.
Yeah.
There could be 30, 40, maybe more. I don't know.
Yeah, and then we have to decide or figure out a plan to deal with them. So you see where we're getting to this idea of there's a lot of work to be done in this portfolio, and then deciding, what the best steps are.
Councillor Charney.
Just a couple comments. I'm a little confused here. The 3.2 million that we talked about for the Save-On area, rail yard, that is the same as the 4,000. Okay, 4 million. So I didn't, unless I was asleep at the switch, I don't think I was ever informed that this 3.2 million, which is now 4 million, was in the flood recovery fund. I don't think we were informed of that. okay? And I'm not criticizing previous council, Councillor Etchart. What I'm saying is, since I've been on council, I have never heard of this fund that is there and hasn't been spent. And what I'm saying is, if we're not aware of it, we should be aware of it so we can do something with it. I like Councillor Petrosi's idea of looking at some houses. I know those units that were just totally destroyed across from the corner store, which is not reopened. They're for sale. And, you know, if we could use money to pick up some of these flood ravaged homes and then rent them out to the victims of the flood, I think that's a better use of flood recovery money. The government has required that we do update our housing needs, but they do also have new requirements that were not in 2021. And this housing, did I already say this?
I don't know.
Goodness, this is bad. I don't remember what I said 2 minutes ago. This housing legislation update and action plan does not address affordable housing. It just addresses housing. Nowhere, I don't think that they talk about TOD. You know, they talk about package A, B, C, but nowhere have I read where it says new housing must be affordable. It talks about the
You're talking provincially.
yes.
They're never
yes.
going to say that.
No, but then
They're never gonna say
then you don't have to follow that if that's not
No,
their
you
mandate.
don't. But
And again,
it
here-
comes under the situation of what you're willing to do for your community to keep people in your community.
That is
So
correct.
provincial government will never say, let's build affordable housing.
Okay.
Absolutely not.
Well, what I'm saying is, you know, we've got this package here and we've got this package here, and they're both a little bit
And
contradictory.
that's why we're sitting at this meeting tonight.
That is correct. And so I just think that we should just take a breath and look at how we can use this money for flood purposes. And because that's what its original intention was. And I'm just saying that 4 million was there. It wasn't used. So let's now use it instead of sitting there.
Yes, which I think exactly what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to make, so as the mayor said, nobody's going to say you have to build affordable housing. The legislation requirements and the discussions around the legislation requirements are, if you build more, it'll become more affordable because we'll flood the market with housing. Which, if you speak to any of the housing experts, people who are, you know, university tenured professors around housing and homelessness, and people planners and things, this is actually a government statement, not a real statement, right? Just because we build more doesn't make it more affordable. Because again, developers are not developers. If your cost of developing a house just for materials and labor is $400,000, that's still not affordable to anybody at the median income in Merritt, right? They still can't get a mortgage on that. So they're not going to sell. If it costs $400,000 to develop it, they're not going to sell it for $400,000. They're going to put it on the market for $500,000, which again, way above what somebody with a median income in Merritt can get a mortgage on. I just went to the bank to talk about our mortgage, and I'm a little bit scared. And I make more than the median income, right? It's very challenging to get approved for a mortgage at this point, to pass the stress test. It's very challenging. So developers, private developers who want to make money on development are not going to do affordable housing. So the idea that the government is saying, we're going to make, you know, easier to build smaller units, we're going to make it easier to build whatever, that actually doesn't translate to affordability unless we put some incentives into that. So, you know, if you're building condos that are $300,000, you're not building a 3-bedroom condo, you're building a 1 or 2-bedroom condo for $300,000, right? So a family of 5 can't live comfortably with no backyard, right? Especially if it's an apartment building. So there's a lot of factors that really impact what that means for accessible, affordable housing in the long run. And I think maybe my briefing note isn't clear enough, but the idea, I think what you're saying, Councillor Charney, is we need to do these investigations. 100%. We need to look at what properties are available and what could we build on. What do we need to think about in those properties around flooding in the future and how the flood map's going to impact them, and what are the changes we're going to have to make to the zoning bylaw to keep those as protected areas where we might have, you know, increased requirements about height of the foundation, right? Maybe you can't build below ground and you have to have a raised foundation. There are a lot of factors around that we have to consider. That work is not work that we are currently resourced to do. So whether we are looking at having a housing corporation where we buy and own things, or we have an have a system in which we work with developers, sort of as a market investment kind of situation, or we have a land trust, or we provide grants with an expectation of, you know, this is going to happen, or we reduce our DCCs in special situations. All of these are possibilities that we have to investigate. And at this point in time, we do not have the resources to investigate them. The reason we want to go internal on this, one of the reasons we want to go internally on this, is because this could become a self-fulfilling, self-funded process where we can continue to provide support for people in our community who are not as privileged as others, right? They work at the gas station, or they're a new immigrant and they have a job in which they're not able to make $150,000 a year, right? So we're looking at, or young families. I think about the fact that in 10 years, my oldest child will be 24 and I'm not sure they're going to be able to afford to move out, right? If they continue as they are. I recently read a study that says housing in the major cities of Canada, so they only studied the biggest 7 cities, but if you think about, you know, there is some scaling around that. Houses would have to stay stagnant. The price of housing would have to stay stagnant for at least 15 years, and wages would have to go up 4% each year of those 15 years to close the gap to affordability. So your house, if you wanted to sell your house in 15 years, it would be the exact same as it is right now, and people's wages would have to go up for them to be able to afford those houses. It's a huge national problem around affordability, and the rules that they've made in the legislation are meant to support affordability by making it easier to build multi-units on smaller lots, get rid of parking, you know, allow us to collect more DCCs and the new amenity cost charges to support infrastructure and things like rec centers and parks. But that doesn't actually address affordability in the long run, because I mean, I look at some of these things and I'm like, you know, a $500,000 house that requires $200,000 of work because the basement's not done and they need a new roof isn't an affordable house. And if you build condos and they're $400,000 condos, that's not affordable. We have to figure out a way to support that affordability. And it, you know, people are getting away from building the 3,500 square foot house on the lot because nobody can actually afford the materials for that anymore unless you're unless you've won the lottery recently, right? Like, we went from these giant homes that nobody can afford now to rethinking how this works. So there's a lot of things to suss out here. And going to an internal position is because we can then take a program that fits for the City of Merritt and continue that program with the resources that we currently have. And if that means purchasing some land or developing land we currently have so that it's development ready, or investing in development so that we get a return on the development so we can then invest in more development, those are all options. Given that every municipality in the province has to do all of these changes to the legislation, so everybody's got to do their housing needs assessment, everybody has to do their zoning bylaw, everybody has to do their OCP, and everybody has to look at their DCCs and develop an ACC bylaw, and probably go to their subdivision bylaw to make sure that those things are all aligned. I'm going to guess that every contractor, every consultant in that realm is probably going to be employed for the next 2 years, and at a high rate, right? They're going to be able to own that market. So, you know, there's a few options for why we're looking at trying to resource this internally and make it like a small department so we can move it forward.
Councillor Hogan? you, Councillor Charney?
I agree with Councillor Logan that we did talk about the 3.2 million, but we were not told it was from flood money. And I also agree with the CAO, housing is unaffordable to build. Nothing is affordable. That word affordable is not, should never be used when talking about housing, because nothing is affordable. It's, pardon?
It's moot.
Yeah, that's right. It is moot. And even for the city to build a complex, there would be cost overruns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, we can't, if a contractor can't build affordable, we can't build affordable. And it also goes back to the fact that we have to have industry. If we don't have more industry in this town, we don't need houses. You know, you talk about no sewer, no water, no town. No industry, no town. And that's what it comes down to. And if you don't have more industry, we won't have a need for any houses, because it's going to be like the mine place. Everyone will be leaving. So I think we have to look at where this money came from and somehow designate it for flood recovery housing. I think that's where it should go back to. And then I also think that we have to really do our needs assessment and then work on industry.
Well, I'll be honest with you, the industry right now is a situation where almost all of our commercial lots have been bought up by people who want to hold and flip. And until you can get them to actually commit, we've got proposals all over the place, but nobody's willing to commit. So until you get that, yeah, it would be great to bring, like I've said, if you have a look at what Merit's industry is now, it's retail. It's now 65% of our income is retail, which means we're turning into a shellwhack by the side of the road. But we do have a lot of property that is commercial, has been bought up, has been sat on. And one of the things that we need to do is prod these people, which we do a lot of. I had a conversation with a landowner this morning to start moving. Possibly we start looking at a vacant land tax to start making things happen, because people sitting on property for 10, 15, 20 years and us not getting anything out of it is becoming unacceptable. Councillor Jarrett.
I agree, and one of the steps that we have to do is the needs assessment review, because the flood impacts aren't there, and I don't disagree with Councillor Charney. It's just that I'm not thinking affordable housing, I'm just thinking attainable. And I think that any kind of builds that we do is going to take a long time to do. I mean, even just trying to get the emergency housing took such a long time that any project's going to take some time. And if it has a commercial space underneath it, I think it could be a good project for the city, and it could really have our 15-minute communities where you have everything that you need within a short walking distance, and really improve our downtown, especially using that property on the rail yard lot, because that lot used to be the old Granny's Kitchen and video store and liquor store at one point in time, and even Farmers Day was never there, but it was a commercial spot and part of our rodeo weekend, which is a real hub in Merritt, which a lot of people in this room might not know, but I know some faces do. So everything takes some time, and the attainable housing is something that we can do, and the whole idea of going with this project is a way to use that money without having to give it back, so we can put it into use by having a corporation. It was touched on in the last council term before the flood, and it was discussed with, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we could have something like this, and it was never put into action. Then the flood happened and we have a real housing crisis. But I think that with all the communities competing for contractors and trying to get all their OCPs and everything done, if we have this funds that we could actually use to have some kind of housing piece that could maybe have some commercial space along with some housing, working in conjunction with a contractor, I think it would be one opportunity that we could have to improve the downtown, bring more people into the downtown, and have some housing built. And maybe we don't have a lot of industry right now, but maybe it could attract some contractors and some tradespeople, because they would have some steady projects. So that's why I'm supportive of it. I know it seems like we don't need the housing because you've mentioned that, yes, there are some units that are available to purchase or to rent. Whether they're affordable is not a point attainable. But I think that if we have an opportunity to either, we have to give the money back or we can try this housing project corporation, I think it's something worth exploring because we certainly know that there's not going to be an availability of grants coming our way. We'll certainly have our hand out for any kind of diking, and I agree we do need the economic development to come. But the whole point is just to discuss, is this housing option something that we should do? And I think we should, because if we don't, we have to give the money back. And what have we done? What's going to be our legacy in 20 years? We had an opportunity that we could have tried something and we didn't. And maybe it could fail, but maybe it could be a great success, and other communities will be wishing that they had come up with something like this. I just think it's something that we should explore, and I think we have an opportunity and some funds, and we should put it out to RFP and see what we can come up with.
So I have a question. We do know that the 4 million that we're talking about came with strings attached. We also know that those strings are unattached once we sell the trailers as per their rules. What happens to that $4 million after that? Are we allowed to still use that for their rules, or does that become an open market where we can do something with? Oh, hold on, I see Mr. Strang.
Come and whisper in my ear before I let him talk, because sometimes he gets excited.
Let's just do this, Dana, and we'll go. Okay, I'm hitting everybody's mics here.
Yeah,
Okay,
so,
he's ready.
sorry, I was watching at home, so I missed about 15 minutes because I was building a LED flashlight with my kid and tuned in a little late. So there was a little bit of confusion I saw in the first 15 minutes in terms of what's been done, the projects that have happened, and then what the goalposts are have been set by the province for this money. So just give me a couple of minutes for how we got here, because there was some confusion, and I caught Adam's discussion Councillor Etchard's discussion on how exactly that happened during the original, how that money was granted. So obviously Merritt, the flood affected about 640 residences. A lot of those residences or parcels had basement suites. Some of them were registered, some of them were not registered. There's upwards of 30 units that have not been rebuilt and could be as high as 50 in terms of actual parcels. But there is an unknown number of actual basement suites that are still not rebuilt, and we don't know that number because they were never registered to begin with, so we don't actually know. All that being said is that we could be looking at something like 50 to over 100 units of housing that were lost during November 2021 that were never rebuilt and haven't been rebuilt. So about January 2022, early January 2022, this whole process started of, hey, there's a whole bunch of housing, it's lost, it may be lost forever, we need to do something. And something at that point was us going to the province and saying, what do you do in this particular situation when your community has been devastated and fully a third of the parcels of the community in that valley area have been affected by floodwaters? And the province unceremoniously got back to us and said, which was basically the answer. They didn't have and still won't have a flood recovery housing program. That still doesn't exist. And so we sat down there was about 4 of us, sat in my sunroom in early January for 3 days straight over the weekend and put together a needs assessment request. And this was basically a big spreadsheet full of a bunch of different things. One of the tabs in there was housing. There was also recovery. There was also, that's where the offsetting DFA funding. So the municipality is responsible for 10% of any DFA project. We've got that covered by the province through that same funding ask. Part of that funding ask was housing projects. We outlined it's either 5 or 6 very loose ideas that we had for funding transitional housing or putting forward a transitional housing project. And the province, in a state of very unpreparedness, just was quite gracious and said, hey, here's $11.7 million as part of this funding arrangement. This 11.7 is for flood recovery related housing. It is to take care of the housing impact, or at least try and make a dent in the housing impact of the flood. And so that was part of the Muni Affairs contribution agreement. Really cool, really exciting. They kind of gave that to us and went, we don't know what to do, so you guys figure it out. Literally has never happened in the history of BC where you've had an agreement like that. So the goalposts that they gave us at the time were, pitch us an idea, we need to approve the idea, and BC Housing needs to approve the idea. So there is some approval authority. It's not just a situation where at the current time the City of Merritt can establish a committee and just say this is the project we're going to do. There is some other bodies that it has to go through in order for that project to get approved. Now that's of course just a contract. Contracts can be changed and renegotiated, but the current contribution agreement has to have it approved by the province and by, by Muni Affairs and by BC Housing. They're both the province, I guess. We pitched, after that point, we pitched 3 ideas. We pitched 3D printed housing, which I'm not sure if it came up in the time that I wasn't tuned in here. So, okay. So this gets to the question of, hey, why is there this money that wasn't spent on housing? It's because we had all of that allocated to projects that had been denied or discontinued for various reasons. 3D printed housing was approximately $3-point-something million. That project, the amount spent was about 75 or 78,000. I'd have to go look at it at a feasibility study, a cost analysis, and a Class B estimate for how much this would cost, along with renderings. The particular parcel was, what is that street? I can't remember. Quilchena, thank you. The particular parcel that it was proposed on was around Quilchena Street. It needed to be rezoned in order to actually build that. It came to council. Council didn't rezone it at that time for various reasons. And the project effectively died on the vine at that point. It was also above the initial estimate cost per square foot on the feasibility analysis. So there's really 2 things that happened with 3D printed houses. Above the cost estimate, and Quilchena Avenue did not get rezoned. That project died on the vine. Another project was proposed, which was called the Accessory Dwelling Unit Incentive Program. And that was the program where we all learned if you don't give the province an acronym, they'll just take the first letter of whatever program you propose and make it. So we had the DUIP program, which is what it's now known as in the province. That probably got, I would say, probably 200 or 300 hours of staff time between Don MacArthur's team and my team to put that program together. The basic idea, I can't remember how many tiers, 4 or 5 different tiers of, if you have a basement suite and you need this to legalize it, we will give you a grant of X amount of dollars. Interestingly, and as a side note, it actually very closely mirrors what the province has now put out in an official provincial program. At the time, they weren't very interested in the program and they denied it on some basis I won't get into. Long story short, it was about $1 million program with that one, and that was denied by the province and discontinued. We were also working on the TEMP, TEHMP, Temporary Evacuee, or TMHP, Temporary Evacuee Mobile Home Program. At the time, that one was approved, and that is, of course, the program that we have. So that is one of 3. That one actually got approved. And I will say that one is a phenomenal program that was completed actually under budget and is being used as an example project. We have about a 50-page write-up on how the project happened, what the hurdles were, etc. That's being requested by governments across Canada at this point. So really good program, completed on budget, achieved all of its goals. The ROC is responsible for the operations of that program. And then we had a chat initially before current CAO got here. There was some internal city work on, hey, what's going on with the rest of these funds. I can't talk about the specific project that was being pursued because there's some privacy and camera concerns around purchase of property and whatnot, but there was a project that was being pursued by city staff at that particular point in time, using the remainder of that money. There were some negotiations around some of the conditions on that property, on that particular parcel, what would be able to be built, etc. We had some staff turnover, some people left who were in charge of that project, and it stalled out. And so we talked late 2023, discussed, hey, this is nobody's, it wasn't passed over at that point. So we discussed how it gets passed over, talked it through, came to a meeting in January or so and said, hey, the city's going to take this over and look at doing some sort of a housing authority and some sort of a more formal structure, because we are past the point of emergency, but we are still certainly within the point where we have housing that was lost that hasn't been rebuilt. I 100% agree with all of the comments here about industry being necessary, and of course myself as coming from industry and this being the first time I've ever been in government and in heavy industrial manufacturing, that's the city's lifeblood. This particular tranche of money was for recovery of flood housing. There may be creative ways that we can piggyback it into a specific development with some commercial, but there needs to be some sort of a formalized structure in order to make that happen. And I think that's what CAO White is bringing forward. So that's a little bit of a quick history on where the money came from and what the process for it was.
Thank you, Director. So that's great. Just stay. Stay, boy. Yeah, so it is a very complex project. And again, apologies, because with the turnover, it did not come to my attention until, most of my staff were trying to actually let me find my office the first couple of months, not bring me their multi-million-dollar problems. But I think what we, when we're talking about this, it is money that we can use to improve the housing conditions in our community, to get more, we talk about they talk about in the housing spectrum, the low market, the missing middle, the below market housing that's not currently available. And I agree with, I said Councillor Charney talked about, getting some of those properties bought that perhaps haven't been recovered. We also have to be cautious and make good decisions about those properties, because some of them are properties we don't want to build in because they are likely to flood again. Not when, or not maybe, but when will it happen, right? Our new flood recovery map, it's not nice. Basically, if you don't live in the bench, you're in trouble, right? So one of the rivers will flood again. Climate change is not going to make it any better for us. And so we need to make informed decisions about which properties we invest in and how we invest in them. And again, this project allows us to do that work.
So my question was, do we have to be still tied to the agreements on that 4 million, or can that be, when we sell the trailers, obviously we do whatever we want with that. Is the 4 million still going to have those strings attached once it's done, or I'm just curious. I'm not trying to ask anything you don't know. I'm just wondering how long that caveat stays on those funds.
This is a super good question, and I'm going to tell you, every single person that I've talked to in government has never seen an agreement like the contribution agreement that we have that includes this funding tranche. It is chaotic. It argues with itself. It is legally difficult to define. It was done in the depths of the flood when they needed to get us some money. So it's really not clear what the path is when you look at the legalities of the actual paperwork. Informally, we've worked hard to clarify with the ministry themselves on what they would like to see in order for Merit to keep this money in an evergreen revolving housing fund. And what they would like to see to remove those exact conditions is this money get moved into a body with its own governance and authority, which under the city, however that exactly gets arranged, they haven't specified. They just want to see a plan for the entire tranche of money, who it's responsible for. The fact that it's not me who's saying that one, and it's not CAO White making decisions on this. There's a governance structure, there's authority, and there is a housing program to make decisions on what's made. After that, it gets submitted to the province, And then we're not in a situation anymore where we're submitting individual projects to the ministry and to BC Housing. We are submitting that plan for the housing authority, or whatever you want to call it. They approve that. That just continues as a structure. Without that structure, they have already been making noise in the last 2 months about that money getting returned.
What's the federal involvement on this? Is there any
Zero.
federal involvement?
There is zero federal, unless there's something in the back going on that we don't see. This is provincial dollars through a direct Treasury Board submission.
Councillor Egan?
Yeah, my question, thank you very much, Mr. Strang. My question initially was just, what are the rules and what's the time frame? When do they want the money back? So how much time do we have to decide what we're going to do with this money?
So we don't necessarily know that. This is one of those times where we just pretend it's not happening and they don't ask us. So but could be at any
Yeah,
time.
like November would be ideal, like the last November. Sooner is better on this particular one. They're starting to make, the province is starting to ask what the disposition of this money is. We've relayed to them that, hey, we're putting together a plan. They've been quite patient about that because, again, this is one of a kind stuff that has never happened before. They're understanding that it takes a little bit of time to put forward. But to answer your question, Councillor Charney, if we don't have something to, Councillor Egan, I'm sorry. I'm looking over here and talking over there. My apologies. If we don't have, my gut feeling is that if we don't have something together and in a presentable form by something that looks like June, they'll be asking some much more pointed questions.
Councillor Charney? Oh.
No,
Okay. I read your mind.
So what you're saying is this money was initially in the flood recovery. We didn't quite use it all, so we have left over. And now you're proposing it to be used just for any type of housing. Or are you saying it's going to be directed towards flood recovery housing? This is where, there's a lot of talking, and we talk about housing corporation, and we talk about attainable housing, talk about affordable housing. But what type of housing are we going to direct this money towards? That's what I want to know. What is the end goal? What is the end goal? Who is this housing going to be directed towards?
Seal.
So I think ultimately we are directing housing towards people who require housing. That is ultimately what that looks like, is very different depending on the sort of like the idea that there are different parts of the community and different socioeconomic sections of the community, right? And we have to address that. So if somebody was living in an illegal basement suite in somebody's house, they probably couldn't afford much, right? That's what we're talking about, is those people who were already living in illegal, possibly substandard, possibly crowded housing. So if we're talking about those people, then we're still talking about people who cannot afford a $400,000, $500,000 house or $3,000 a month in rent. So that's the population that is most impacted by the flood. They were uninsured, probably for their belongings. They had no other options around housing. And because some of those basement suites were not brought back online, they're often the people that we're currently putting into our temporary housing right now. Whether or not people are going to be able to afford to purchase those temporary houses when the time comes, which we'll be exploring very soon to start getting a sense of that. We don't know at this point because we're still a year and a half away. And again, resourcing to make sure that we can get this work done is really important. So I cannot say that it's not flood recovery housing, because it is. We need to have more affordable or attainable units so that those people who weren't able to get back into illegal basement suites, etc., can actually afford their housing and get into those maybe smaller 1 or 2 bedroom spaces, maybe families who were living in basement suites with 2 or 3 bedrooms and again can't afford what's available currently on the market, because those people who are renting out suites are renting to make a profit. Developers who are building houses are building to make a profit. There is no support for the missing middle and for the lower income families.
Councillor Hogan.
Yes, so I feel like
CO.
So I guess a couple of things, and thanks to the director. We are doing a new housing needs assessment as part of the requirements of the new legislation. That has to be completed by the end of this this calendar year, and the RFP, I think, is going out on Friday. All of the municipalities and electoral areas are just confirming that we're happy with the collaborative RFP. So I believe the goal is for it to be out on Friday or Monday, with just an update of our housing need assessment in order to meet the legislative requirements. This is where we also, and I know that, you know, there was comments about the housing and homelessness strategy. This is much like our economic development strategy, right? We have a housing needs assessment, but we don't actually have a strategy to act on those needs. Just like our economic development strategy, and I've seen several of these economic development strategies where, you know, things like attract more industry. But what industry? Who are we attracting? Where do we spend our time and our money? Where do we put our efforts, right? And so that's what we're working on over the next 2 years, is getting all the data we need to make informed decisions about where best to invest our time and money in economic development initiatives, because we have a very large gap in that data. Our house, like I said, our strategy doesn't have any actual actionable steps, and it's very cut and paste like many of these are. The housing is the same. What we're looking for tonight or in the near future is for us to have a structure that we can present to the province, not necessarily a project or specific housing or how we're going to do it. We need to have a structure of some sort, or at least a plan to develop that structure through research to find out what the best practices are and what's going to have the most impact for the city of Merritt. Because we do have these resources, we have these financial resources that we most places don't have. You know, Canmore, Burnaby, Sunshine Coast, Comox Regional District, Capital Regional District, I'm sure some of the other Lower Mainland ones. All of these places are developing similar structures or using similar kinds of ways to ensure that there is some investment in housing that people can actually get into based on not being a millionaire, right? And that's where this comes from. This is not a novel pitch, but what we're looking for is a structure to be able to start developing that program, whether it be a housing corp or some sort of investment corp or a funding grant program that is a not-for-profit that is overseen by the city, like it's still owned by the city and it's overseen by a separate board to help make those decisions. So again, it's not about housing today, it's about how do we get to housing? How do we make those decisions on what gets built with that funding? And we can't do that until we have the resources to develop a solid plan.
Councilor Petrosi.
Mr. Strang, you said how many houses are actually officially vacant from the flood damage? Do we have an exact number? Because we really should be looking at dealing with these vacant houses, vacant properties. Are we even collecting taxes from these vacant, like?
We will be, yeah.
We will be?
I think it.
Of course, sure.
But
I think anything where there was I'm sorry, I'm having a word finding problem. Well, anywhere where there was like
Structure damage?
One of the things that
where
you
we
have to,
weren't collecting funds for anything, those have all
Right.
ended.
right.
Right, so
Yeah.
any part of development or anything where, you know, you didn't have to pay for a development permit or a building permit, all of those things are ended. We're still collecting taxes, we're still collecting parcel taxes. All of that stuff is still happening. And again, you know, those are options about how we could address housing is by purchasing some of those. However, some of them might not be places we want to put more houses.
Right, right.
So those are, again, things that we have to map out and figure out. And part of developing the structure or the plan for how we're going to move forward is using some of this money to resource that plan. I gave you a very extensive budget. We might not get to all of that work. We might not have a board before the end of the year. We might still be sussing this stuff out. But, you know, if we're thinking about we have to have our office space for them with some furniture in it and staff, And those staff wages are what our wages are right now for those levels of positions, either collective agreement wages or excluded employee wages. So, you know, there are things that we need to do to start as startup costs that don't get carried over from one time to the next. The $182,000 that's in the budget is the money that the province has provided to us in order to make all of these changes to our various bylaws and OCP and to do the housing needs assessment. That's not going to cut it. That's not going to cover the work that we have to do. It was based on a base amount for municipalities and a separate base amount for electoral areas, and then a percentage, a dollar, like $5.20 or something per person per capita of each community, which gets us to $182,000. But that money is not going to be enough to do all the work that we need to do to address housing issues in the community, or to do all of the updating and things that we need to do for the OCP and the zoning bylaw.
Do you think that's going to change come election time? You think if a new government gets in, they'll drop all of this stuff?
So hold on
Lord
a
only
second.
knows. I don't even want to fathom a guess.
Councilor Petrosi, are you done?
Well, I just wanted to put it out there that these homes that are sitting vacant, they're gonna just get worse and worse. We're going into another year where weeds are gonna start growing again. What are we gonna do with these properties, these homes, and do we have a plan going
Well,
forward?
also
on
too, you
those?
have to realize some of these homes are still dealing with insurance.
I know,
claims.
I know,
And
yeah.
so-
And there, a lot of them are.
So much
So-
Three
of
of my
the
neighbors
question
are.
about fires and fire affected homes, which
You know,
the CO did some work on, it's going to be a similar process. We will have some action that we are allowed to take. It's just whether or not it's palatable to council to take that action on flood affected homes. So, you know, you guys can make that decision. You can direct us to deal with them as unsightly properties. I also wanted to talk about, just throw out, because I think the mayor was talking about people buying up land. So the province is also looking at flipping and speculation taxes, which we could possibly mirror for people who are coming in and holding or vacant property taxes, vacant land taxes. There's a lot of ways, again, I think I spoke about this last week, the stick and the carrot, ways to get people to develop or to put that land back on the market.
Councilor Richard.
Another reason why I'm in favor of the Housing Corporation is if we have the funds to possibly build something. I mean, talking about the steps of the housing needs assessment that Councillor Ogan was talking about, I mean, that's in the next steps. That's number 5, ensure data is available, completing and updating housing needs assessment. That's going to happen if we proceed with this. FCM last year, when the mayor and I had gone on one of the tours that were provided, was one of the projects that happened was a few-story, I think it was a 4-story apartment building that was put up in a modular construction that had multi units, and it had more than, say, 2 bedrooms. It was an apartment building that was basically modular, kind of like not really mobile home, but it was put up fairly quickly, less than a year, and it accommodated a high number of families. I mean, when we put out something for an RFP, there are great possibilities that could really offer maybe attainable housing to people who have been
Catchphrase, attainable.
attainable. My new favorite word.
Yep.
Attainable housing for people who have become homeless due to the flood because their rental that they could afford has been destroyed or not been replaced. And at FCM, they had a tour of good possibilities where buildings were repurposed instead of 1-story commercial buildings. It had maybe buildings with a setback that had multi-unit stories in them, which is in our OCP right now. But thank you, Don MacArthur. But honestly, we have a lot of options that are available. We just have to, if we can proceed with this corporation, then we can proceed with something, being that there is actually a small option of some funds. I just think that we should consider this, because if we don't, and we have to give the money back, we'll have, well, what are we doing for the community? Nothing? Why not?
So just so everybody that's here understands, this is a meeting where we don't make any decisions or pass anything. This is where we talk about it for it to come up to another meeting. So one of the things that I want to bring forward, especially with the new 44, 46, and 47, is the fact that the province also has to deal with the fact of the 5-step program that will cripple exactly what this is trying to fix. And until they have a look at that, and I think that's where we need to kind of raise our voices a little bit, is in order for it to be attainable housing, you can't put these requirements on that add almost $70,000 to a house. So it kind of shocks me when I was at the symposium when we zoomed in. Almost every community was in the same boat, a total bewilderment of where this is actually going and who it's going to help. Because until we start addressing some of the things that will, the minister talks about housing a lot, but he doesn't talk about how we get there. And announcements are great, but have some substance. Councillor Charney.
I'd like to get the breakdown, the $183,812, that is for the capacity funding, that is to update our bylaws, et cetera, our OCP. Now that's, how does that break down from your proposed startup budget? Because we got 2 wages, and I'm not really too sure if we need a director and a clerk, 2 people to do this job if it gets passed. I think those 2 wages are extremely high, and they increase like $12,000 or $12,600 in 1 year. The wages are increased, and that's a nice increase.
Yeah, that's the cost of living increase.
I wish I had that. But anyway, I would like to know how much how much more is coming out of this proposed budget for the increase of time for the bylaws, the OCP, the housing needs assessment. Because I as you know, CAO, I got an email from the city of Chilliwack, and they are absorbing they are doing this internally with their own, no new positions. Well, they're doing it internally, plus they are adding some municipal money to it.
Yeah.
So this is what I wanted to know. Do we necessarily need a director and a clerk? Because this is where a lot of the money is going, and like as I said, it's a budget of $975,084. That's a big budget.
It is a big budget. I ask for the moon, and you make decisions. Ideally, this would be a department that would become its own entity, which is then again why you see things like board compensation. Many of these boards get compensated for sitting on a housing board. It's just the thing. We did the housing needs assessment. I had put $50,000 in, but it looks like it'll be 15 because we're going to be doing it collaboratively. So that amount will come down. But you'll also see things like the pad rentals for the mobile home project is coming out of this budget. The repair and maintenance, I put a relatively small amount. Property management for those mobile homes.
There's no insurance on here.
No, either. I didn't. Sorry, I missed that one. Developing some sort of actionable strategy for housing and homelessness in the community so that we have the tools to advocate to BC Housing to do what needs to be done around homelessness, but also we have actionable steps based on our housing needs assessment to actually address those needs, right? We don't have that at this point. That's another step. I mean, that might be relatively high, but ultimately, again, it's going to be the consultants are going to have the pick of the litter in this situation because everybody's going to be doing this work. So that 183, we've also applied, or we'll be submitting an application on before Friday for some, what is it, LD, I don't know. It's development funding. So it's up to $150,000 that we can use to improve our development processes. So we'll be applying for an additional position that we will then be able to do most of this work internally. But at this point in time, we're trying to do many of the things. So like, for instance, our building bylaws from 1982, we're just coming to the end of updating that internally. So we had originally budgeted $50,000 for that. Sorry, the building bylaw update. 30. So we originally budgeted 30 for that to go to consultants. We're doing that work in-house. Subdivision and building and subdivision and development bylaw. We again have not been able to come to get a consultant at a reasonable cost, we're going to be doing that in-house. The zoning bylaw, the initial parts of the zoning bylaw that have to be done by the end of June, we should be able to do most of that in-house because a lot of it is cut and paste from the guidelines. So there is a lot of it that we're trying to do in-house, but ultimately what we're trying to do to avoid using municipal dollars, which is what Chilliwack is going to do because they will be using municipal dollars probably for some additional staff. We're going to be applying for this funding to get an additional person in-house to do that work. So will give us an opportunity to go through and look at all of our processes and how they work together and make sure that our bylaws actually match each other and that we have, you know, the easiest possible checklists and guides for people who are doing development. So that whole process will fit into all of these bylaw updates in our attempt to not use municipal dollars.
Quesnel, what they've done is they've hired Urban Systems and Lidstone and Company, and they've got 5 communities that they're all grouping together, and then it's $20,000 for them to get their bylaws, et cetera, and everything up because they've gone it as a group. Mm-hmm. And it's much cheaper that way than doing it.
So those are things we'll look at, which is why the housing needs assessment is the first big project, right? The zoning bylaw, I feel confident we can do internally. The housing needs assessment we can't, so we're doing that collectively with the TNRD, which has greatly reduced our costs. And then as we move forward with the OCP, we'll have to look at how that's going to roll out as well. And what the cost of external consultants are going to be and whether or not we're going to be able to get on them, right? Because that's the biggest problem at this point is that every single municipality has the same time frame to get all of these things done. And so if we can find ways to collaborate with people, we will. But ultimately, if we can find other funding, even better.
Well, I really appreciate you trying to find funding and collaborating, but I also agree with Councillor Petrosi. I think that this money we should, when we do the housing need assessment, I think we really have to look at flood affected housing and victims to see how it can be put back into that system where it came from, because that's where it came from. I'll keep going back to, I'll just start, sorry.
No,
but that's where it came from. That's what its original intention was, for housing for flood affected victims. Now I know it's hard to go back and find them and say, you know, we're going to build a house, because you can't do that, but at least we could build something or go on to, I'm just going to say those rental units. If, for example, you took those rental units on Coldwater, you fixed them up. And the people that could apply would be those that were living in illegal suites, etc. But then I'll go back again to your flood mapping. The diking has to improve so that half our town is not a flood victim area. Half of this town was flooded because our dikes were inadequate to begin with. Nothing to do with the citizens of Merritt, but they're now suffering because they are in a flood victim zone, or a flood prone zone, I should say. It's going to affect insurances. It affects the value of their home. And maybe we should have a program where some of these homes are totally gone. I love where I live. I live on the river. But we were told after the last flood that that whole street should have been bought out. The city was aware of that, and nothing happened, and we were flooded again. So we have to take some responsibility for protecting our citizens, which is a proper dike, and then we have to look at those that have been affected and help them out. I think those are 2 priorities. So because a lot of people were affected, and they're lost into the wind, and you know, I feel badly for them. I was affected, but I recovered. Mm-hmm. But I know a lot of people never recovered.
So just so you're aware, whatever we do here is council decision. Mm-hmm. You will be deciding, you will be driving this. So just so you're aware,
Yeah, I know.
the ultimate end is what you're asking for is exactly what you can push forward as we move along. But the point of the matter is, in order for us to do this job, we've got to have somebody who can actually do it for or help us through it. We're talking about a $10 million investment, which I don't know anybody else that would just simply say, okay, let's wing this thing. We've got to have people who know what they're doing here. And we also have to be aware that this is a situation that doesn't come along every single day, and it doesn't. So that's what this meeting is about tonight, and that's what we need to work towards to make a decision on where we need to go. In my area, 7 homes were dropped. They were never replaced. So 7 rental properties were lost, and there's still some people that are still trying to recover from it. CAO.
I 100% agree with the concerns around the diking, and we have funding for some of the diking. The issue is we don't have the millions of dollars to invest in the rest of the diking plan. In fact, we're having to look at alternatives to what we want the diking to look like versus what we might be able to afford if we don't get our DMAF funding, and if that DMAF funding does not include purchase of properties. We don't have $21 million to purchase properties. Just like probably when you were told that street should be bought out, there is no legal obligation for the city to purchase your home if you're in a flood zone. You've made a choice to build in a flood zone. A river beside a river is a flood zone. I think pretty much beside any river is a flood zone. Inadequate diking was definitely a problem. Diking that nobody gave somehow became the responsibility of the city that the provincial government didn't in fact give us any money for. Right? This is again a downloading issue from the province. Here, be responsible for this, but we don't have any money for you to up your services. Right? And this is a consistent thing that's happening. Do this, but we don't have any money for you. Do this, but we don't have any money for you. So until we get all of that money that we've applied for, or get some response from DMAF on that money that we've applied for, we can't do anything else in regards to the dikes. The director and his team are developing a plan where instead of buying those properties, we end up building right on the river, which is going to look sort of like a giant canyon. It's going to negatively impact the habitat. Right? So until we get that funding, a response would be nice. I'm saying that again, a response from DMAF would be nice. We don't have a lot to say about this, right? So there's little to nothing we can do about the diking that we don't already have funding for, and that we have some parts that are identified as, so around the public works yard, obviously, because that's important for our water sewer. There are a couple of other places where we do have some diking funded, but ultimately, and the bridge, repair of the bridge. But we're kind of in a position where we don't have money to do this work.
There isn't a week that goes by that myself and the ROC team is not inquiring about DMAF, what's going on, where we are. Just this week we had a meeting with Jackie Taggart, Minister whatever, about trying to get something done here. We've now moved into a new Minister, Sajan, from Minister Blair. A lot of promises were made. Our application is solid, probably one of the most solid out there, and it's a paint by number set. It's all done for them. The idea that we get absolutely zero response, even through our MP, who I'm having dinner with tomorrow night. There's a lot of concern about us, and there's a lot of concern about the other communities that have been left behind. A lot of promises were made, but were never delivered on. So every week we hammer on this, just so you know, because we need to protect this community. We are extremely lucky that we have low snowfall, and I mean, that's kind of an oxymoron because now we're looking at a drought situation. But right now, we can't fight high frechette, and we can't. And I've invited 2 ministers to come and walk this with me, and all of council, if they so wish to see what we're dealing with. And we'll continue to prod and poke until we get something, because it's simply not going to go away. And whether you like it or not, we're in a competition with Princeton and Cache Creek and Grand Forks, and the minute that Abbotsford throws in their $1.6 billion request on top of everything else, this is something that should not have gone on this long. This is disappointing, to say the least. So
yeah. So I mean, just to respond to that from Councillor Charney, I'm not to lecture, but for those of you who don't know, all the time, we're working on getting money for dikes, all the time. And it's not going as we want. We've done some great work. The ROC has done some fantastic work to secure the monies that they have, but it is not sufficient to protect the city. So we may never get that money. There could be another hurricane on the East Coast, and we don't ever get the DMAF funding. A city could burn down in this next fire season, and we will never get the DMAF funding, right? That's what we're talking about. That's the battle right now, right? Tuktoyaktuk, their school is falling into the ocean because of sea ice loss, because of additional wear and tear from the surf onto the land. We may never get DMAF funding because they apply for DMAF. Like, there's a lot of things that restrict our access to this funding. So sometimes it doesn't matter how much we advocate or fight for this community. We're at the hands of the provincial and federal government around this funding, and we may never get it. So we have to have alternatives. And the alternative is we might have to purchase some properties and help develop some sort of housing that those folks who were displaced from whatever housing they were in because of the flood, we can work with this funding to develop additional housing. And that's ultimately what we're looking for, is housing to help those people who are displaced, housing to help families that are struggling, housing that might be transitional for people who are, working to get off the streets. Whatever the case may be, how do we support that housing happening? And developing a program or an authority of some sort that ultimately works on this portfolio is the first step to being able to keep our $4 million and have a good plan for the rest of the funding once we've started to sell those trailers. And then moving forward, it allows us to make investments, whether it's purchasing land in city center and having a commercial space with 2 or 3 levels of housing above, or, other types of infill. I don't know what that's going to look like until we have the resources to do all of the research.
You said
Attorney?
sorry, you asked for the moon. Can you tamper it down a bit? And
That's up to us.
yeah, okay.
That's totally up to us. Yep.
You can tamp this down like we do with our regular budget, right? Like, you make the service decisions. I ask you for what I need to get the best possible job done. You can say, oh, I don't think we can afford that, so let's do this instead. That's fine. We'll make that work.
With the caveat that cutting the garbage truck budget in half means garbage is collected half the amount of time.
Right. So, we might not get to the same place that we would with 2 staff with only 1 staff, is I think what the director's, that's his analogy.
I thought he was really talking about garbage.
There are parts of this that we can certainly bring down. I mean, we could be, like, for instance, I have board compensation. We may not have a board until 2025. There are things we can't cut, like the pad rentals. Well, that's what the pad rentals are, right? We have to have repair and maintenance. Maybe we're looking at a different model for property management. I'm not sure. We have to decide what we need to do. That's all I got.
Councillor Egan.
Okay, well, based on what Councillor Charney said, as well, just in the last statement we could see what a scaled down version would look like. I think that I would like to approve this in principle, but wait to see. I'd like to be involved on the board or involved on the ground floor of your mission statement and your goals. That's the way I see it.
Again, Councillor Egan,
I know we're not. I know.
This is your vehicle to drive.
I know.
This is what we end up leaving as a legacy to this community.
Yeah.
So it better be the right one.
Yeah.
But this is up to us to move.
And I encourage council's participation. And I think ultimately, no matter what, however the board works out, there would always need to be a council member on the board to help direct and bring information back. It would still be like, this would still be an entity. It would be an arm's length entity. of the city, which is why you'll see admin fees, right? Because we would be responsible for accounts payable, accounts receivable, auditing, human resources, all those things, because this, we don't want to necessarily, we're not going to be able to necessarily flesh out an entire organization, especially at the beginning, that would be able to manage all those functions. So that's why there are admin fees to the city, so that it offsets some of those costs that come to the extra work of the city, right? Whether that means we hire, we pay an extra $30,000 for the audit because of this, then that gets covered, right? And then all of our other staff time, my time, the CFO's time, the CO's time in particular, and for a while, the ROC's time as we're making this transition. I'm still not giving you more money. Yeah. So I 100% appreciate that you would want to be involved. I think there's a time for all of council to be involved in the initial development process.
Councillor Cherney.
Okay, since I'm driving the bus, then,
You're
or partially driving the bus, I've got one of 6 hands and next 7 hands on it. I would like to see options for the different housing projects. I would like to see not just a housing project. I would like to see different options for who you're targeting and how you're going to target it and what type of housing, etc. So I would like more information than just a housing project.
Well, so that's where we don't have the resources right now to do all of that work. That's why we need this. That's why I've brought this to you, is to develop those options to get the right direction from council. So we can't make all of those decisions based on the resources that we currently
But
have.
if we're driving the bus, we have to know where we're going.
Right,
That
you're giving me the resources, a staff person, to give you that information.
That would be the needs assessment, would it not?
Well, the housing needs assessment, but this person would be doing an environmental scan of what's working out there and what's going to fit best for our approach in the city, right? There are lots of different models. What is the model that fits for our city? And how do we move that model forward? So that's really the first several months of the project, is to determine how we're going to meet these housing needs and what the best model is for the city through this development corporation. Because at this point in time, we don't have the resources to do this work.
Councillor Cho.
I can appreciate your point, Councillor Charney, that you'd like to see some costs. Just like with the compost plant, it's nice to see some costs of what it's going to be to the city when we have these things that we have to run for operating. But when we know, okay, there's families that have 3 kids that are finding a hard time finding housing because a typical rental is between $2,000 and $2,500 a month or whatever, and we have that data, maybe it can be through some of the apartment styles that had been presented in the past. There was different housing pieces that had been presented to us, 2500 block and the 2600 block of Forksdale in the past, different presentations that happened in the last council term that had models showing different housing options with 1 and 2 bedroom. But unless we approve this, like this is step 1 of many, and if we don't approve this in principle, well, forget finding any kind of housing costs of anything, because they don't have the time, and that's the whole thing. We have this money that we could possibly do this project, and if we're going to even explore anything, we either have to approve this in principle at the next meeting, of course, because we make no decisions, but it's either we do it or we don't, and it's a great opportunity to do that, and we can explore anything because we're not all going to agree for sure, obviously, well, you and Councillor Charney, you're like twins, right? So you guys often think the same. So, but my point is that if we're going to look at anything, we have to kind of move forward. If we're going to go ahead with this and, move or get off the pot or whatever, but let's do something before we have to give the money back. Otherwise, we have a legacy of nothing. That's all I'm going to say.
Councillor Egan.
Yeah, and I would just like to address that same thing. Approve it in principle, and then we get to guide where it goes with Councillor Charney, sorry. We get to make some decisions on exactly what the structure is going to be. They're guiding principles.
Yeah, I have no problem with that. I just want to make sure that we are on the right trajectory. We approve something and then all of a
It's in
sudden it
principle.
shifts over this way.
Well, that's
So
why we drive
that's what
the
I
boat.
just, yeah.
These
Well,
are your
it's gonna be a
decisions.
boat
These are
if
your
it
decisions.
floods
Okay.
again.
Yes.
So, Councillor Ogan.
Ultimately, the first goal is to determine the structure that we're going to use, right? So what kind of program are we going to run? Is it going to be that we are going to own property and house people through city-owned property? Is it that we are going to invest in development in some fashion? Is it that we are going to buy lands and prep them and resell them for development so that they're easier to get to and they're already developed and we can reduce those costs? Like those are or land trusts, or like there are so many options that I think the first goal is determining what is the best fit for our city. And then the second goal is to take the direction and whatever decision is made about which fits best for us, set up the authority or corporation or whatever we're calling it, terms of reference, board structure, all of the policies and procedures, so that basically by time we get to the end of 2025-ish, 2026-ish, really once we start the process of recouping funds from the mobile homes, we're in a process where we've got something planned for that fund. At least a first off kind of project, right? But we don't know what kind of project we want to do until we know how we want to do those projects and how we're going to invest these funds into those projects. So I think those are ultimately, by the end of the 2 years, is to have identified how we're going to do it, have the structure all set up and ready to go once we have that additional, because ultimately $4 million isn't going to necessarily get us where we want to be, but having the additional funds coming from the mobile home sales hopefully will get us to that place where we have enough to invest in development.
Councillor Egan.
I was just wondering as well, do you have any idea how many of the people that are living in those trailers right now are thinking of buying them? Can they afford to?
So that's data we're going to start collecting very shortly, because we've also been having discussions with the property owner around extension and how that's going to happen. Are those trailers, people going to want to buy those and move them out? So we're going to be collecting that. We're going to start those initial conversations in the next month or so we can start to see what that transition is going to look like. Some people may want to purchase it now if they know that's an option, right? Rather than continuing to pay us rent. So we'll see how that goes. We'll also have to determine, council will have to make some decisions on the costs of the sales, what we're looking at for the sale and how those sales will proceed. So we'll be bringing that information to council as well in a closed session.
Thank you. Mr. Strang.
Again, just a rule clarification. I don't, the ROC itself isn't responsible for the disposal of the trailers and the $4 million. So I don't actually know what's all in this proposal. I just wanted to add a little bit of clarification on what we're hearing the province is expecting, because I'm seeing through the funds and doing the accounting and everything behind it. They're not looking for, hey, this is what we want to build. And having that discussion is going to be important in the future. What they're looking for specifically is council to buy into a specific model for deciding what gets built. And what that basically means is that council needs to approve what is a housing department, very, very similar to how council approved a recovery and mitigation department for building the dikes. Council needs to show the province clearly that they're buying into the concept of starting up a housing department. And so what CAO White is saying is that that structure and those particular individuals and skill sets don't exist within the city of Merritt right now. And so coming up with a whole bunch of analysis in terms of options, what the governance looked like, who decides, is beyond the capacity and skill set of it. So the province wants to see that council is on board with the principle, and yes, that does certainly cost money and cost people and cost time before anything tangible happens. I can tell you 100% that we are by far the most successful flood municipality at attracting funding, and the reason for that is the people involved. The reason for that is because the mayor's out there knocking on doors. The reason for that is because I have 2 finance professionals who are able to generate an incredible number of spreadsheets down to the decimal, and the provincial government knows that that money is being tracked. That requires people. That requires me. I'm flying to Victoria on whatever the hell I do, March 22nd at 6 a.m. and back at 9 p.m. But that's people. That's not tangible items. That is people. And housing is going to be the same thing, where people are needed. And that's really what the province needs to see, is that there's a plan to hire the people and a vote of confidence to proceed forward.
Okay. So I guess I'm going to contradict myself. We have 2 recommendations here. Do we want to just leave this for the next meeting coming up and then vote on it then, or?
Well, I think that if council has, would like to give us a direction on what recommendation they would like to have come forward at the next council meeting, and again, we can, you know, the recommendation could be a budget with 1 staff member to make this happen, a budget with however you want to do that, because I think the recommendations I had put in here specifically
You
were.
have 2 of them.
Yeah, there were 2 of them. Approve the housing merit project and the financial plan as presented. So you could say with 1 staff, and that they approve the organizational charge amendment to, because right now it's going to be, until we have everything sorted, it's going to be an internal department until it transitions to an external department once we've got a governance structure and all of those sorts of things in place, right? But right now it would report directly internally to me. So if those are the recommendations council would like to bring forward, you know, you can take out the admin clerk if you like, and that the financial plan presented with only the director position or whatever you like. If you can give us direction on where we're going, then we can put actual recommendations or resolutions in the package.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. She says we can vote on it.
Okay. No, I know we can, but just, so for myself,
She gets
okay,
mad at me
so
when I make you vote too soon.
I'm going to wing this. So the recommendation that we have before us is that council approve the housing merit project and the financial plan as presented. Don't feel we need to make a change there. Recommendation 2, that the council approve the organizational chart amendment to include a housing merit project director. And that's where I'm going to leave it. And remove the administrative clerk at this point in time. Seconded by Councillor Etchart. Comments, questions, queries?
So then you're cutting your wages and benefits down?
Yeah.
Then?
Of course.
Okay, yeah. Does it need to be a director, or can it be an administrative clerk?
No. So what I'm looking at is other like there's been a ton of these going out recently, like every day I see new ones. So I'm looking at something that is going to be at a high enough level position to do the research and to do the synthesis of the information to provide us with recommendations. That's not a clerk position, that's a director level position. And then I'm also looking at what the other municipalities are putting out for wages so that we're competitive to get somebody.
Do we have the capacity to promote within?
We do not, because within our planning department is one of the places where we would have this. We are already promoting within, and we are going to need additional planners. As I said, we've applied for this additional funding to try and get another planner position for the time that we need to do all the zoning or all the bylaw updates so that we can use internal resources to do that.
And you can thank the province for that.
And this is a 2-year position?
Identified this would be a 2-year position, and then it would ideally
Be opened up?
transition to being a housing like its own entity. And that person may be the person you transition over, or they may choose not to. We can make, again, it's hard when we're only hiring on a term. And I hate to say this, but if we hire somebody full-time and there's no further work for them, you are allowed to lay people off in positions, right?
Councillor Egan.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify then, if we approve this in principle, as what the mayor has said, it says next steps. If council wishes to pursue the housing merit project, the next step include develop the job descriptions. Who will be doing that? Develop a product charter, including timelines, deliverables, and success indicators. So I think at that point, the board should already kind of be in there, or, you know, to kind of determine the focus areas.
Yeah, so I think what I had envisioned, and council can certainly give me some direction on this, because it is a big thing, is that we would be developing the job description, myself and the manager of human resources would develop that job description. We have lots of examples. As I said, like, there are so many of these going out right now. And then they would develop the project. The person we hire, if we hire them in a timely enough fashion, would start working on the project charter. And again, that would be a document that would come to council to outline what this is going to look like as it moves forward over the next 2 years, and what the deliverables are for the project over the next 2 years. And then part of that would be also developing those terms of reference for the board, what types of people does council want to recruit for the board, and then the board would be able to start getting involved. So a lot of it, I know it says 7 steps, but a lot of them are concurrent. You know, including like community engagement, step 6. That's yes, but there's also, that's going to happen multiple steps, right? So there's a lot of concurrent work that will be happening at the same time. If for some reason we're unable to hire someone in a timely fashion, likely we will look to other municipalities and look at their project, how they're doing it. Again, I have several examples where I will put something together to help us guide to keep the project moving if we're unable to find somebody in a timely fashion. I really hope not, because we also have asset management and safety programming and several other big projects on the go. So my desk is full, but we will keep it moving. This is a very important project, and we will keep it moving as best we can if we don't get somebody right away.
Councillor Egan, are you done?
Oh, no, I'm done.
So with that, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Councillor Hogan opposed? Carried. Thank you for the input, everyone. And with that, we will terminate the meeting. Thank you.